Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Resilience and Disaster Risk Management Week of DPO's Learning Days. As you may already know, in lieu of our annual Learning Week, we are providing space and time for you to learn at your own pace, as well as to participate in any of the GSG weeks with technical learning opportunities on the latest topics. And our learning catalog also includes over 200 archived technical sessions that were delivered over the past couple of years. In case you missed them, these recorded webinars are available to you to choose from and view at your own pace and at your own time. As such, I would like to advise that this session is being recorded. You can type in your browser GPER Learning to get the latest information on the learning days. We will be also requesting you to fill out a survey following the session, and Miguel will kindly share the link in the chat box shortly. So today's learning event will focus on lessons learned and operational good practices on the hybrid development policy operations with Catastrophe Deferred Drawdown Option, in short Cat DDO, particularly on the experience from the Pacific Island states. The hybrid instrument was designed for small countries with limited capacity that are highly exposed to natural hazards, but this can also be applicable in other regions and other countries. The format of the session will include a presentation followed by a discussion. I will start by summarizing Pacific context, and my colleagues will proceed to present on the Cat DDO and hybrid instrument and the use in the Pacific. Then we move on to the policy reforms supported by the DPOs and Cat DDOs and lessons learned. We will also invite comments from our discussant on the campus, and before opening the floor for discussion and questions from the audience. The World Bank has engagement in 12 Pacific Island countries, each with their own unique cultural identity, customs, language, and history. Yet they all face similar challenges with respect to disaster risk management and climate change. They are geographically very dispersed and isolated. And as an example, it can serve islands of Kiribati, which extend about 2,400 miles from east to west. This is almost the span of the US between east and west coast. This results in logistical complexities and limited economy of scale. The Pacific countries are all impacted by heavily by climate change, yet as small island states have very limited control over their future. It is forecasted that before the end of this century, significant portions of habitable land in Pacific atoll countries, such as the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Kiribati, may be permanently inundated. In addition, they have limited human, technical, and financing resources. As an example, Tonga National Emergency Management Office has less than 10 staff, and the country's GDPs are among the smallest globally. Pacific countries are located in the so-called Ring of Fire and the Pacific Cyclone Belt. This means they have high exposure to a multitude of hazards, and this includes earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, cyclones, floods, storm surges, and seasonal droughts. The changing climate is contributing not only to sea level rise, but also to more intense and frequent tropical cyclones. The effects of the natural hazards are further exacerbated by urbanization and migration patterns, including internal migration to economic centers and by uncontrolled development in urban and peri-urban areas. Natural disasters have significant impact on already vulnerable livelihoods of small economies of the Pacific Islands. For example, in 2015, Cyclone Pam caused around 450 million of damage and losses in Vanuatu, and this translates to almost 2/3 of the country's GDP. And more recently, in Tonga, volcanic eruption and subsequent ashfall and tsunami waves cost an estimated 90 million in damages alone. And this equals to 20% of Tonga's GDP. With this quick overview of the context and the challenges, let me now hand over to Artessa Saldivar Sali, Senior Municipal Engineer, who works extensively in the Pacific Islands and has been TTL of several Cat DDOs and IPFs in the region. Artessa, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Yolanta. So we just wanted to present a bit of a snapshot, and Yolanta alluded a little bit to this as well. I think that anybody working in small island states is very, very familiar with this profile and these statistics. But basically, what has been a very strong entry point in our dialogue with various countries in the Pacific has been the countries and clients' own realization that there is a word that's overused now, but still true. There is an existential threat posed to small island states from natural hazards. And so, as Yolanta mentioned, whereas the two biggest cyclones in recent memory, Tropical Cyclone Pam and Typhoon Haiyan, occurred within years of each other, Tropical Cyclone Pam caused 64% of GDP in losses to Vanuatu in 2015, while Typhoon Haiyan, while being the strongest typhoon to make landfall in recorded history, only caused 0.9% of losses to the Philippines' GDP in 2013. So when this instrument became available in IDA countries in 2018, there was really an almost immediate uptake and an immediate interest from clients to take advantage of this option. And you'll see the earthquake in Haiti, 121% of GDP, and in 2015, Dominica and Vanuatu really showing a spike in disaster impacts in both IDA and non-IDA countries. So there really was not such a difficulty in having dialogue about why this is needed in the Pacific and in small island states in particular. Next slide, please, Jan. So we can talk a little bit about the history of our engagement in the Pacific. Actually, this slide is structured in non-chronological order because the engagement in DRM in the Pacific really started with post-disaster reconstruction or emergency loans. And because there have been so many disasters of high impact, and great magnitude, including tsunami in Samoa, several tropical cyclones that have caused devastating impact, the bank's engagement in DRM in the Pacific really, unfortunately, began to take off with the use of emergency loans. And we know that these have their own advantages, and chief among them are the fact that we can provide technical and implementation support for resilient reconstruction. And so we learned quite a bit about building standards. We learned quite a bit about how to engage with communities. We learned quite a bit about land issues, especially in the Pacific, because of the customary nature of land tenure and ownership. And we learned that these can support longer reconstruction programs. And these really served as the entry point to having dialogue with the countries about building back better. And these started the dialogue in many of our countries, Vanuatu, Tonga, Samoa, around the importance of building resilience and disaster mitigation, disaster risk reduction. But as I think we probably all know on this call, it takes time to prepare these emergency loans. No matter how quickly you move, it still takes about 3 to 4 months. And of course, the bank's procurement regulations, procurement guidelines at the time apply to these IPF operations. And so you didn't have that very useful feature of immediate liquidity that the Cat DDOs have. And then over time, we actually moved to having resilience building and risk reduction IPFs. And we started introducing CIRCs. And so the CIRCs, of course, alleviated a little bit of that constraint in terms of being able to quickly mobilize funds, because of course the CIRCs allowed for quick reallocation of uncommitted funds. And so a little bit of that predictability of the contingent financing started to become a regular feature in our dialogue with the governments and in our instruments and mechanism of support to the governments. But again, the CIRCs, of course, had limited size. There was a desire not to, quote unquote, cannibalize the main or original project. And we still need to use IPF procurement, FM, and safeguards. And so there is some complexity in the disbursement, which makes the CIRCs not always as quick to use as we hope. So come 2018, when the IDA Cat DDOs were introduced, there was really a strong demand in the countries for this immediate liquidity, for this pre-prepared contingent financing. And of course, as we know, with thanks to GFDRR, we're able to bring grant-funded technical assistance to support the development of the policy actions and the reform actions. And there was this very nice incentive that global IDA resources were used to match the national performance-based allocations of the IDA countries. The question was, in the Pacific, where there are already robust DPOs, where there were already robust DPO series, series of 2, series of 3 in almost all of the countries, majority of the countries. The question was, are we going to introduce yet another type of development policy operation when we already have these robust DPO series under preparation, under implementation? And so working with the CMU, working with our MTI colleagues, of whom Demet is one, and she'll be presenting a little bit more about these pros and cons. The team worked with MTI and the Pacific CMU to develop the hybrids. And so we recognized that in such thin capacity environments, where policy dialogue is already, not so easy all the time, it could be a good option to combine a Cat DDO with a regular DPO. And hopefully Demet can talk a little bit about this. It not only reduces preparation effort, but also allows for DRM considerations to be mainstreamed in the overall policy dialogue. So one very clear example that always comes to mind is when there are procurement reform actions in the regular part of the DPO, then in a hybrid, we can actually start having dialogue about emergency procurement reforms for post-disaster situations. So that's just one of many kind of mainstreaming opportunities that arose quite organically when we started doing these hybrids. Now, then the question is, how strong does the policy reform matrix end up being when it's quote unquote diluted with other reform areas? So this is still a question and still something that we're working on to ensure the strength of the reform actions is there. Next slide, please, Jan. So this is just a snapshot of Cat DDOs across the Pacific. As you can see, uptake has been strong. And where there has been one, more likely than not, there ends up being two. And this really shows that the opportunity is there, the demand is there. In Vanuatu, the first Cat DDO, it happens to be a standalone, has been drawn down. In Samoa, the first has been drawn down. In Tuvalu, the first has been drawn down. I stand to be corrected about the others, or perhaps Jan and Habiba can mention whether they have been also similarly drawn down. Tonga, of course, has been drawn down for the volcanic eruption. So this really shows that there's a strong uptake and strong pipeline of Cat DDOs. And then the last thing I'll say about my final slide, please, Jan, is that in Vanuatu, we actually have a standalone Cat DDO, and this has had the opposite effect, which is through a Cat DDO, it opens the door to macroeconomic dialogue. And so in our two standalone Cat DDOs, we always have a macroeconomic policy action where there was no regular DPO to begin with. So it can actually work the other way. I think I'll stop there and pass on to Habiba. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Atessa. Good morning, good evening. Thank you for joining. It's good to see some familiar faces and quite a few new ones. So I just wanted to try to sort of highlight three conditions under which we have Cat DDOs working quite well. One is, I think Atessa alluded to it, is when is the DPO going into the country and the DPO engagement? So really the timing of the DPO. The second is really what kind of engagement have we had, which will mean that we have strong prior actions already. Atessa sort of mentioned the need for these. And to me, looking at where we started engaging, and our first engagement was in Samoa, was really these two conditions coming together, which made sense for us in small island countries to really come up with a DPO combined with Cat DDO rather than the two going alone. I'll bring in Demet now to really talk about how we've been working with the macroeconomic or MTI team to really make sure that we're not putting extra burden on these small island countries, but really using our resources and their resources efficiently. Demet, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, Habiba, thanks for the invitation and great to be here. So as you know, for the country economists working on the Pacific, the economic impact of climate change and natural disasters and the potential policy responses are at the cornerstone of our dialogue with the counterparts. To address these issues in MTI-led DPOs, we have fiscal policies to help contain the externalities from climate change. This could be revenue measures, expenditure measures, or on financing, and typically included under a fiscal sustainability pillar in a DPO. The synergies with the two GPs, as Atessa and Habiba also mentioned, and this started with the inclusion of a climate resilience pillar in DPOs, which brought in the DRM colleagues to DPOs. And in countries where the client requested a DPO and also indicated interest in a Cat DDO. At the same time, it made complete sense to have a hybrid operation. We've now had hybrid operations in a number of countries, as you saw in the map earlier. Over the past few years, I worked on Fiji hybrid operations with Habiba and on Tuvalu hybrid with Artesa. And I know Jen has been working on several in Tonga and others as well. On the advantages of these operations, I mean, this is repeated, this is already mentioned and I'll be repeating, but they save us and the government the transaction costs. And we cannot emphasize this enough, particularly for low capacity settings like the Pacific. Second is the content. A very strong content on resilience and DRM is very much welcome, given the IDA commitments. And in EAP, we have even more ambitious targets on climate. Another advantage, which I think would be an important advantage from your perspective as well, is the ability to influence the policy reform agenda in these countries. As you know, and as you may know, perhaps in the Pacific Islands, the joint donor matrix for budget support is adopted. And World Bank country economists usually lead the development partners dialogue with the client countries on these multi-year joint policy reform programs. So the inclusion of the DRM team in this dialogue, and I know in cases where Habiba actually leads the dialogue together with our economists in Samoa, so we're not only influence the government's reforms and priorities, but also other development partners on DRM resilience, and sometimes mainstream them into other reforms, as Artesa mentioned earlier. Strengthening collaborations and relationships through these operations is invaluable. We're building relationships within the government that are not traditionally partners, relationships with other development partners whom we wouldn't normally be working with, or internally across GPs, whom we wouldn't be normally working closely. And this is all achieved as a result of these hybrid operations. We learn from each other, and which has a long-lasting effect on our work on future DPOs and Cat DDOs. In fact, we now see the DRM team as being co-TTLs in our standalone DPOs, as we have currently in the Fiji DPO, or the MTI team as co-TTL role in standalone Cat DDOs. So overall, this has been a really positive experience, and we look forward to working with you colleagues. Thank you. Over to you, Habiba.
Thanks a lot, Demet. So really sort of, for me, the prior actions become a really important part of what do we bring in. So our team, I think, just because we're involved in disaster and reconstruction, disaster management and reconstruction, as well as the climate change agenda, means we come in from multiple GP perspective rather than just a single GP, and we cover many aspects from the technical perspective. So that engagement really means that we have a suite of prior actions and policy reforms that we can start the conversation with the government on. For us, in almost all countries, we were involved in TA or prior IPFs before we started really becoming involved in the DPO with the Cat DDO. And in fact, in almost all countries, we were involved even in the DPO before we combined it with the Cat DDO instrument. So again, the sequencing of that, as well as our engagement and dialogue with the countries, is really important. Next slide, please, Gian. Sorry, you've ended up controlling the slides, but thank you. So let me move on to one of the major hurdles, but also one of the major rewards of working in this DPO with the Cat DDO instrument. So for me, as part of our engagement in the country, we tend to have quite a number of operations where we have worked with the government. So I'll start off with an example from Vanuatu, where we were engaged with the climate change and disaster risk management conversation with the government for almost 3 to 4 years. And we had a DRM legislation that was being developed. We did the bill, we helped the government do the bill. It was going to the parliament in terms of being enacted. And we were able to pick that up as part of the ongoing conversation with the government as a prior action. And it was a strong prior action because it was embedded in our longer term engagement. In Fiji, we actually did the climate change bill. So it was an ongoing effort in almost 3 years. And then it picked up things that we can pick up in the future, which is mitigation in the current DPO, with the Cat DDO, we'll pick up the adaptation aspect of it. But it also includes some of the forest management and some of the ocean management, and therefore fisheries. So really sort of bringing in our engagement and our dialogue backed up by operations, backed up by investment into something that really changes the policy space in the country becomes really important. In other countries, we have supported Fisheries Act and also solid waste management, which in fact controls flood and levels of flood in many countries, because if you don't have solid management, our investment projects aren't able to control the flood. So by having these regulations come in, it's a nice way of sort of saying, yes, we can have investments, you can have TA, but really you need those policy reforms to make the country more climate and disaster resilient. One of the other things that takes time, and again, something that we have done through TA and investment operations, is really risk-based spatial plans, which is covered in the second line in this slide. This really has helped, is helping countries like Samoa, but also in Vanuatu, say where can you put in critical assets, whether they are electric generation assets or like power lines, or whether they are buildings for the government or even the National Emergency Operations Centers. So having that risk-based spatial plans, which can be participatory in these small island states, is really helping us do the anticipatory adaptation, anticipatory risk management, rather than coming in after the disasters to really help the government with the reconstruction efforts. The other thing that I think we are engaging more and more with governments, including Fiji, but also Samoa, Tonga, is really on multi-hazard early warning systems. So at the moment, they tend to be fragmented. They can deal with a single hazard. So really bringing in multi-hazard approach and impact-based approach is something we can push from the policy sides in the Cat DDO and then link it up with the IPFs and TA to really make sure the investments and the support is there for the government. And I think same's applied for housing policy, which we brought in Vanuatu, but I think there's prospect for doing that also in Fiji. Let me move on to sort of the new areas where we as the DRM team can start having conversations with countries where we may not have GPs having engagement in there. So in Fiji, there was a social protection team and social protection engagement as a TA for a long time, and really sort of bringing in the policy reforms into our DPO and Cat DDO conversation has been really important to make this into not just something that they think about, but really have an outcome that they can look at. So the results in a DPO and a Cat DDO just as important as the prior policy reforms as well. And for me, I think the bigger other sectors that are coming in is transport or infrastructure in general, but also the National Oceans Policy, jobs and nature rehabilitation. So essentially, we can cover, as I said, multiple sectors. It's really based on long-term engagement. It gives us a menu of policy reforms that we can bring in, and then we really have to make sure the timing of it is ready from the government side, but it's also ready in terms of our operation and TA support. And it is a nice way sort of to round up the whole of our engagement in the country and then build the pipeline for either other standalone DPOs or standalone Cat DDOs or the hybrid instrument in these small countries. Let me bring in Jian now, who will really go into how the nuts and bolts of these DPOs and Cat DDOs work, right from preparation to actual disbursements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Habiba. So this is the last section of our presentation, and we'll go into a little bit about the mechanics or the nuts and bolts of hybrid operations. And just to summarize a few of the lessons learned, I work, as Dem mentioned, mostly on the hybrid Tonga DPO with Cat DDO. And as I think a lot of you would have seen in the news, there was a 1 in 1,000 year event for the volcano Hunga Tonga Hunga Ha'apai. that occurred on January 15th. So our Cat DDO, the hybrid DPO Cat DDO was approved in November 2021 and made effective in December 2021, while the disaster occurred just a few weeks later in January 2022. So it was very timely that we had this hybrid operation in place. So the Cat DDO component was $8 million and it was drawn down in full. The DPO component was already dispersed back in December 2021 when the project was made effective. And as Yolanta and Atessa has said before, these disasters really do impact the economies of small Pacific Island countries. So, the GDP of Tonga is only about $500 million, whilst we did a rapid grade report thanks to the DRAS team from GFDRR, which calculated that approximately 20% of the GDP was impacted by the disaster. And over 85% of Tongans were directly affected. So with a hybrid operation, it's one operation and one policy matrix, so one program document, whilst there are two financing agreements, one for the DPO and one for the Cat DDO. It's a 3-year implementation timeline, so whilst many regular DPOs are only 1 year, this timeline allows for a bit more time for more complex reforms. Just some of the, the mechanics, especially in terms of what OPCS has been asking us recently, is particularly if we are including a public health emergency as part of the Cat DDO drawdown trigger, it's absolutely critical to talk not only about the DRM systems, but also about the health systems and the health program. So they're increasingly asking for very frank write-ups on the strengths and weaknesses of both the health and DRM systems. And in Tonga, this included very candid assessments, including on the PFM, the public financial management arrangements, the government's commitment to health reforms, and also, overall assessment of health systems performance. We included in Tonga a health-related PA for that was related to the COVID National Vaccine Deployment Plan. So, it wasn't only just the write-up and the assessment of health systems, we included a prior action that focused on a health-related reform. At the board approval, the country must have an adequate macroeconomic framework, as well as a satisfactory DRM program in place or under preparation that the bank monitors periodically. But this is not required at the disbursement of the DPO, nor when drawing down the Cat DDO. And we found that we had to remind some internal clients and delegates about this point during the drawdown for the Tonga Cat DDO. And I think one other good point about the hybrid is that the Cat DDOs often include climate-related actions or reforms, and this can really help to maximize climate co-benefits for the hybrid. Probably just the last point I want to mention on this slide is that the disbursement is really critical to understand properly. So the DPO, as I mentioned before for Tonga, disperses upon the prior actions being achieved and the operation becoming effective. While the Cat DDO, as we all know, has a pre-specified drawdown trigger, which is typically the country's declaration of a state of emergency. So this is the contingent financing that can be available to the government to draw down either all or part of the contingent finance. Next, please, Miguel. So these are some of the financing terms for Cat DDOs in IDA countries. So up to 0.5% of GDP or $20 million US, whichever is higher. And this is quite useful for countries with very small GDPs like Tonga. They are very attractive terms for IDA countries. The front end and renewal fees are set at 0%, and there's no commitment charge. For IDA countries, the Cat DDO can be renewed only one time for a total maximum period of 6 years. So the usual implementation timeline is 3 years, but it can be renewed once up to 6 years. The pricing is IDA concessional rates at drawdown. With the source of funding, currently for IDA 19, from the country's national IDA allocation, the country will be matched with contributions from the global pool. So essentially, it'll double the country allocation. However, we are awaiting information from OPCS about the IDA 20 arrangements because we understand that the contributions would actually be quadrupled for IDA countries in IDA 20, although that's still to be confirmed. but that would obviously be quite attractive for IDA countries. And the other key point is that the country's core concessional IDA allocation portion of any undisbursed amount from the Cat DDO can be recommitted upon expiry if the funds are not drawn down. So, for example, if after 6 years the funds remain undisbursed, the national IDA allocation can be used for an IPF or another instrument. Next, please, Miguel. So, just to summarize, this is the last slide, and just to summarize some of the lessons learned that we've already heard. So we talked a lot about collaboration, and Demet commented about the great collaboration internally between GPs. There's also strong joint collaboration across government agencies and across development partners. So in Tonga, we have this joint policy reform matrix that's led by the NTI colleagues. And because of the hybrid, the disaster risk management team has been able to support this joint policy matrix and work with government agencies to not only talk about the disaster risk management and climate change prior actions, but also bring in resilience building into the other policy reforms, as has Viva mentioned. Capacity is a key point. So as we've discussed, small governments often have limited bandwidth and space operationally to do multiple operations and multiple projects. So it's key to develop a unified policy matrix. So there's not a Cat DDO pillar, it's actually just one unified policy matrix. And this policy matrix is reflected in the 2 financing agreements and the 1 program document for the operation. And this helps to ease the burden on government in terms of operational efficiencies. With regard to timing, I think this is something Habiba had mentioned earlier regarding the opportunity for programmatic DPOs. So in Tonga, for example, we had a series of 2 DPOs led by MTI, and the first one was a standalone DPO, but it included some resilience actions. And the second DPO2 of the series of 2 was combined as a hybrid with the Cat DDO. So that was due to the way that the government wanted it structured, due to the need for the timing needed for some of the more complex reforms on resilience related to disaster risk management legislation. So it's important to think about the timing when developing these hybrid series. And then the other quick one I would add on this timing is that it's also useful to think about when a standalone Cat DDO will be useful for the country. So Atessa and Tevi work on a standalone Cat DDO in Vanuatu with the NTI colleagues. And it's something we're exploring in Tonga. So they've had their hybrid DPO with Cat DDO. And because it's been fully drawn down, the government really wants to have a Cat DDO in place before the next cyclone season, which starts in November. So we're now exploring with the government whether that should be a standalone Cat DDO, because the next DPO series led by MTI is not expected until much later in FY23 or even FY24. So that's another consideration. And having a standalone Cat DDO should be strategic. It's often very useful when the disaster risk management team has various IPFs or other engagements, TA engagements that can really build and help support the standalone Cat DDO. It's also quite important to be flexible. So the policy matrix in Tonga really fluctuated over the course of preparation based on the government's needs. And we really tried to address their most urgent demands on the change in legislation that was needed, as well as the disaster risk financing and insurance policy that was prepared. And one other point on flexibility is the drawdown trigger is also designed to be as flexible as possible. So for Tonga, we considered the new legislation, the Disaster Risk Management Bill that went into the states of emergency declaration and also included public health emergencies. So we tried to be as flexible as possible with the drawdown trigger. So my final point on looking ahead, I've mentioned about the IDA 20 potential quadrupling of the IDA's country allocation. So that's something to look forward to. And we also think that it's important to design PAs for Pacific Island countries that will be even more relevant. So as Yolanta mentioned in her opening, Pacific Island countries have common challenges, but they have unique identities. So unique solutions are needed. It's not just one region. And some of these ideas, as Habiba's already mentioned, are adaptive social protection, including digital systems for post-disaster payments, and potentially some policies on redundancy in telecommunication systems. So we saw in Tonga that the volcanic eruption really disrupted telecommunications for the first couple of weeks and ongoing to the outer islands. So I'll leave it there, and I will pass back now to Yolanta. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gian, Artesa, Demet, and Habiba. Great presentation. So with that, I would like to introduce Anna Campos, lead disaster risk management specialist from the Africa region, as a discussant to share her feedback and reflections. Anna, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Yolanta and team, for inviting me to this session. I think it's a very timely discussion. And also, as you have highlighted, is a very unique instrument that gives a lot of opportunities, especially for IDA countries. And I want to build on that because being Africa, one of the largest IDA list of countries, we have learned from the experience in the Pacific. And I want to share very quickly what we did in Malawi. We were preparing a standalone Cat DDO. We had like strong 8 prior actions, but the country was hit by a tropical cyclone in the middle of our preparation. So we wanted to scale up the program, but we were not able to do it because of the country limits and the IDA regulations. So we combined it with a DPO, adding additional resources on the DPO side. And also we had a very strong discussion on what are the resources that are needed now versus the resources we need for the future emergencies. So we were able to add the DPO component to disburse for that immediate emergency, keeping the DDO part or the Cat DDO part for future emergencies, and combining in one instrument even the possibility of responding for 2 emergencies. So that was a very unique opportunity, and we did learning it from the experience in the Pacific also. One of the things also that I wanted to highlight, as Viva and you have described, is the opportunities to have a very broad agenda in the type of prior actions. With the corporate commitments now and the corporate priorities on climate change, and now on strengthening preparedness after the pandemic and after COVID. So we have expanded the growth of the prior action that we had originally thinking only on the DRM agenda to a more comprehensive climate resilience agenda, and also including the health issues. And in that sense, institutional strengthening, have you mentioned risk information, urban planning, sectoral elements, risk financing, you name it. But one of the things also we have to, once you make you formulate the first Cat DDO and you get the DRM build and the policy here and there, we can think also on the second generation of Cat DDOs, moving into the implementation elements that are required for those rules or policies that we just approved in the first set of prior actions. Know how we institutionalize, how we put information tools to make effective implementation, how we put resources, budgets, etc., into the implementation of all those different prior actions. So we normally think about DRM, builds, policies, etc., but let's move also towards what are the institutional challenges that countries are facing also in the implementation elements. And that will expand your opportunities for identification of prior actions. One element that I wanted to bring on the table also is the confirmation that the IDA 20 board paper has ratified that opportunity of quadrupling the resources. It has been approved, so we now can announce it to our clients and can start working on that element. And that's going to have a huge impact in bringing back the Cat DDO agenda that has been in standby because of the COVID for 2 years, that we were not able to put contingency resources during COVID times. As we're thinking in small islands, low capacity environment, IDA countries, one thing that we have to think also is how we strengthen the PFM capacity and implementation of the disaster risk management agencies the creation of contingency funds in addition as potential prior actions. But also we had the challenge, and I won't name the countries now, but of having a Cat DDO ready to be disbursed after an emergency and having the recommendation of not disbursing or not depleting the resources because we were afraid of countries misusing the resources. So we create really the transparency and accountability that are required for emergency management, we will kind of be able to manage those issues. So as we work in lower capacity countries, we also have those risks that we didn't have in IBRD and other a little bit more advanced countries. So those are kind of the different opportunities that I see now: priorities, climate preparedness, the additional incentives, the broader agenda, and the discussion between the hybrid and the standalone Cat DDOs is when we need the resources now or later, and also how the DPO agenda is moving forward. So I think those are very important elements that apply not only for the Pacific, but for our agendas in all countries. So I would like to open the floor now for a broader discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And indeed, I would like to invite those who would like to ask the questions to maybe raise hand. But in the meantime, I know that Juan Pablo had a question. I know he had some problems with connection, but are you able, Juan, to ask question?
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question, simple and complex question, but what have been the mainly challenge in the implementation for from perspective of government in this area? For me, it's very important to know this experience. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I ask who would like to jump in to respond to a question among our presenters and maybe discussion.
Yolanda, I can jump in, and I see Priscilla has a question in the chat box, which I think I'll answer with the same answer. So Priscilla's question is, can the presenters talk about the ability of the bank to motivate long-term commitment to the policy reforms, which can take time to be fully implemented, by which time we're on to the next operation and set of triggers? She gives the example in Tonga, where commitment to implementing their housing resilience policy has been weak over time. How is it addressed? Do we recycle conditions where implementation is not occurring? So I'll answer this with one example, also Juan Pablo's question. So what we found to be really useful in Vanuatu, as I mentioned earlier, we have a standalone Cat DDO there. And, you know, it's actually quite true that, of course, the prior action, the reform action needs to be accomplished. So the policy has to be enacted or adopted or approved before board approval of the Cat DDO. But what happens afterwards? In Vanuatu, for example, one of the prior actions in our first Cat DDO was to establish a national disaster recovery framework. This was intended to ensure that recovery from future disasters was cognizant of resilience measures and all the other good things that go into a national disaster recovery framework. Now, it's all well and good to say, yes, we have adopted, enacted, approved a national disaster recovery framework, but what happens afterwards to institutionalize that? So one, we of course had TA resources, grant funding resources to help with technical assistance to ensure that the right experts, the right specialists were brought in at the right time to assist the government with certain specific aspects of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. But more importantly, I think We had an IPF ongoing at the same time, the Vanuatu Infrastructure Reconstruction and Improvement Project, a post-disaster project that had aspects that allowed that IPF to contribute to the development and institutionalization of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. So we have a Cat DDO and an IPF running in parallel, along with grant-funded technical assistance, to ensure that this institutionalization of the reform happens. And in fact, in our second standalone Cat DDO, there's now, one of our prior actions is actually a Disaster Recovery Act, which stemmed from or was a recommendation of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. So it's a combination. We combine TA, we combine IPFs, but like Priscilla said, we actually can take the next step through the next operation. So those are some of the opportunities that we've been able to see in Vanuatu. Thanks.
Thank you, Artessa. And I see that Habiba raised her hand and would like to add on. Habiba, go ahead.
Thanks. So the Artessa covered many of the points that I had, but I think the other point is really the results. So as Gian said, our Cat DDO is run for 3 years, and we are supposed to help the government monitor the results. So in fact, having that joint TA and a joint conversation with development partners, involvement in the series of DPOs, so not just the Cat DDO, also helps in making sure the results are being achieved. If we see any weaknesses in terms of implementation of the policies, which Anna sort of picked up on, is really important. And that conversation over 3 years and ongoing engagement through the Cat DDO and the IPF and TA really make sure that things don't just fall through the crack. Thank you. I see Gian has his hand up too.
Thank you. And Gian raised his hand, so maybe I give floor to Gian.
Just very quickly, I think this comes back, Priscilla's question comes back to the timing. And so for Tonga, you know, Priscilla, as you know, the reforms to the housing sector are quite unique, right? In the Pacific region, the government has established a housing sector resilience office. And as you rightly put, it takes time for this to be implemented. So I think this is the benefit of having this DPO series with working with MTI, is that the DPO1 was a standalone DPO, and it initiated this reform in the housing sector. And DPO2 with the Cat DDO has that 3-year timeline. And as Habiba mentioned, it just allows for more time for the more complex reforms to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Gian. I don't think I see any further questions from the participants, but maybe I will just quickly follow up something that Anna alluded to, which is a use of funds disbursed to budget. And this is a perennial, I think, issue of all DPOs. And, you know, we had these questions also with other Cat DDOs, especially from the public sometimes after the Cat DDOs are disbursed, and questions the government how it was used. But instrument itself, you know, does not require looking into that, and it's not designed to monitor it. So if I can ask our presenters, and maybe Anna, because she started this discussion in a way, to jump in. Maybe Anna, you can start, and I will ask others to reflect on that, and experience too from countries following the disbursement. Thank you, Anna, please.
Yeah, I mean, we had a very unique issue. Is other DPOs were not able to go to the board, for example, in Malawi. And I will mention a specific example here because we are here in a safe environment. But when we started the Cat DDO, because of the emergencies, the humanitarian kind of dimensions, etc., donors allowed the bank to go through and get the Cat DDO approved. But after the emergencies came later, there were a lot of questions of how the government was using the resources. So one of the things that we think really as one of the lessons, and based on our experience in other countries, bringing the contingency funds to the government not only creates the culture of also putting some money aside beforehand, even small amounts, but also to create a channel. Although we can't condition where the Cat DDO is going to go and what are they going to invest, and we can't monitor how money is invested because it will be a huge liability for the bank. But if we create the rules, the procedures, and the culture, through these contingency funds and the mechanisms for the quick procurement with more transparency, etc., that will create a safer environment for us in environments where there are corruption issues or even a misperception of how the resources can be managed. So I think we are trying to incorporate as one of the prior actions, always a risk financing kind of pillar with some elements on the contingency funds. Although we don't say it, we don't condition the resources, we go there, but it's a starting point at least to create a culture.
Thank you, Anna. I see Gian raise his hand. Gian, please go ahead.
Just a very quick response to that. I think it's an important one because I think even internally with CNU, there were often questions when we supported the drawdown of the Tonga Cat DDO of what will the financing be used for? What can we say in the press release? So there was some awareness raising even needed internally to explain that, as per the DPO policy, we cannot, guide the government or, require the government to use it for X, Y, Z. But as Anna mentioned, I think there's, for example, in Tonga, we supported with the FCI team, the finance team, a disaster risk financing strategy. And that helped to work through the technical, layering of different post-disaster financing instruments and what each instrument could be utilized for. And if I can just take one quick opportunity to correct something. So thanks, Armando, for correcting me about the limits for the Cat DDO for IDA countries. So according to Treasury, the country limit is set at $250 million or 0.5% of GDP, whichever is lower. It's that IDA countries with limits below 20 million may request a Cat DDO up to $20 million. So apologies for the error, and we'll make sure to fix the presentation. Thanks. I'll pass back to you, Yolanta.
Thank you. And I will invite Habiba. Habiba, yes, please.
Thank you. So one of the things that we didn't really cover is the pressure that comes in when it's an IDA credit. So we had Fiji as an IBRD country, but under IDA 18, late in IDA 18, they became an IDA eligible country, but they're an IDA credit country. So then people look as though they're borrowing money for post-disaster response and recovery. So there's a lot of pressure on the government to say, what are you using the money for? So the two things that I think are helping us, instead of us having to say, what is the money being used for? One is countries have been actually reporting on what they're using the Cat DDO money for, which they don't need to do, but they're doing it. Samoa definitely has done it. I think to a certain extent, I think Tonga will do it as well as part of their reporting. And they'll also talk about it to the development partners. The second one is we worked with IMF on doing assessment, a pilot climate assessment. One of the things that they found is the countries actually have weaknesses generally on PFM, the public financial management, but also on reporting of climate and disaster financing. So what they're doing is through their normal budget reporting and budget documents, they're taking on the commitment of the IMF joint World Bank finding to say, how can we actually strengthen the oversight of the spending, especially post-disaster, but also just because people think that these small island countries are getting a lot of climate funds. So they also want to strengthen that. So I think that sort of plays into the question that was asked. And I think it helps us as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have 1 minute to end, but I see that Natsuko commented. Natsuko, would you like to, especially use this opportunity of having all experienced TTS to ask about the risk-based spatial planning in the context of Cat DDOs and policy aspects.
So as I wrote in the chat box, we do have a hybrid Cat DPO led by Armando.
I couldn't hear you very well, to be honest.
Is this better?
No, we cannot hear you.
Okay. Is this better?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Sorry about that. So thank you so much for all the presenters. So in the Maldives, we have a hybrid Cat DDO led by Armando and an IPF co-led by the urban and DRM team. And some of the challenges that Habiba explained in terms of the specificity of the small island countries, I think we share in the Maldives. And we do see the challenges of capacity and bandwidth, as well as sort of the development that has to go on is very different from some other neighboring countries like India or that are bigger. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about some of your experiences of working specifically on small island country challenges. And I also see that Armando has his hand up, so maybe he wants to add. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. And Habiba, yes, very briefly, I see Armando. Jan, how long we can I give a couple of minutes longer for this discussion? Very good. I got some up from Jan, so that's good. Habiba, maybe yes, if you can reflect on the question from Natsuko.
So I just wondered, Yolanta, if you wanted Armando to ask his question. At least we have that in record, and then we can deal with the responses. Thanks.
Thank you, Habiba. You're very kind. I just wanted to follow up on the same question and maybe offer this our perspective, because indeed Maldives is a different situation from what we have been talking, because naturally, we expect that the prior actions are the natural step that we take after building a dialogue, as you have very well explained during the presentation. So in the Maldives, we didn't have a dialogue when we started with the Cat DDO. That's why it's a little bit challenging, but the commitment is there. And the other two Cat DDOs that I can mention in the region where we have some experience to share is the Nepal and Bhutan, where even though one has been fully disbursed and the other 50%, countries continue to be committed to the delivery of the resource indicators, and they keep asking us to support them to meet them. So there is no issue about them. So the lesson here is just to follow up the dialogue that we have built with them. So with that, over to you, Habiba. Thank you.
Thank you both. We can definitely discuss this on a longer offline and do it in detail, but just a quick answer is really, we've been doing risk and vulnerability assessment in some countries. So what we really have been able to do in Samoa, and partly because it only has 2 main islands, is to produce a digital elevation model. But you need LiDAR for that. So if you can find ways of doing participatory sort of mapping, risk-based mapping, that will help you in sort of identifying where things are. And then you have to do a best guess thing as to where there might be more storm surges and things like that. If you don't have the LiDAR data and therefore digital elevation model. But I think the more islands you have, the more challenging it is. The more atolls you have, the more challenging it is. But there are methodologies that you can do in a quick mapping. We've done it in São Tomé and Príncipe, for example, and they're then more expensive as well as more costly in terms of the time in doing the risk and vulnerability assessment. We've definitely used it in Solomon Islands, so there are different ways of doing this, but you might not get as comprehensive risk-based mapping as you have for countries like Samoa. But it's a good topic to come back to. Thank you. And thank you for the questions too.
Thank you. And before closing, this is the last intervention that I am, I think, allowed to come in. So Anna, yes, please.
very quickly to announce that we have a land use planning risk sensitive session tomorrow at 8 a.m. DC time. So I invite you to participate there and continue the discussion on how we use that in investment projects and DPOs. So it was just to make the announcement and to open the opportunity to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I would encourage teams to reach out to our presenters and to our team, and other way around. And we understand there's a lot of good experience, and among us, I think that this is the group, and there's more people very experienced, and those who I often reach out to with questions, and when in doubt. So this is really nice conversation, which I hope will continue after the session. With that, I would like to encourage you all who participated to fill this survey, and I think Miguel, sent the link, so we would appreciate it. And I would like to thank all the presenters, and most of them based in Australia, had to wake up very early, so thank you for that, but also all participants, and for discussions, and to Jan for organization of this session. So thank you very much, and we certainly will be in touch on the Cat DDO.
And Miguel too, Yolanda.
Oh, Miguel, definitely. He was the engine behind all this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Yolanda.